Today, Alec Murdoch was charged with 2 counts of murder in the deaths of his wife Maggie and his son Paul. Maggie and Paul were brutally murdered at the Murdoch family home in Colleton County on July 7, 2021. It's been over a year. During that year, a web of criminal activity relating to financial crimes has been uncovered, and Alec, along with 3 other individuals, are now facing multiple criminal charges brought against them by the South Carolina State Grand Jury. Many people tuned into this case have been asking the following questions. Why did it take so long for Alec to be charged with these murders? Is it normal for it to take over a year to see indictments in murder cases? And now that he's been indicted, what happens next and how long is this going to take? Let's start with the basics on murder charges in the state of South Carolina. South Carolina's Code of Law states murder is the killing of any person with malice aforethought, either express or implied. Unlike the majority of states, South Carolina criminal laws do not specifically define or delineate degrees of murder, such as first-degree murder or second-degree murder, under its state statutory law. So the words malice aforethought and express or implied in that one sentence are extremely important. West's Encyclopedia of American Law defines malice aforethought as a predetermination to commit an act without legal justification or excuse. Simply put, malice aforethought is the mental condition that the prosecution must show in order to achieve a murder conviction. Depending on the prosecution's theory, malice aforethought could mean several things, including intent to kill, intent to inflict grievous bodily harm, reckless indifference to the value of human life, or intent to commit a felony. If it can be shown that there was sufficient legal provocation on the part of the accused victim and malice aforethought was not established, the perpetrator may be convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. So now that we know how South Carolina defines murder, how do they build their case after the murder is committed, and why did this particular case seem to take so long from the day of the murders to the actual charges being brought? Let's rewind to the actual day of the murders. From the moment that law enforcement officers arrive on the scene of a homicide, after determining that the area is free of any danger and that the victims are deceased and not in need of medical assistance, the goal is to preserve the scene and gather physical evidence. In South Carolina, depending on the scope and nature of the crime, either local police, county or city, for example, or SLED is in charge of a homicide scene. In the case of the Murdoch murders, SLED was called in by the Colleton County Sheriff's Department almost immediately, as they saw a clear conflict of interest and likely realized this would be a high-profile investigation. First responding officers and detective in charge of the case should determine the perimeter of the crime scene and immediately control and carefully document who enters and exits the area using a crime scene log. The crime scene log is important as it shows who enters and exits that perimeter, what time they did so, and what their purpose was for entering. They would also need to obtain a search warrant unless they are able to obtain a consent to search from the property owner. Once a lead detective is assigned and all proper consents or warrants are obtained, they will work closely with a crime scene investigation team to begin the process of gathering and preserving physical evidence. Now, while the scene is being secured, officers should be taking careful notes of the scene. Who is there and why? What cars are there? What do they see? They would also identify any witnesses and separate them to be interviewed. Now about that physical evidence. The handling of physical evidence is one of the most important factors of the investigation of the crime scene. When collecting physical evidence, one of the main goals is to avoid contaminating it. To avoid contamination, it's important that only certified crime scene technicians handle physical evidence. Some of the steps that technicians and officers take are to wear personal protective equipment and to use sterilized equipment for collection. The evidence should be carefully documented as it is collected and preserved, and then a chain of custody is established to show each person that handled it. Officers would also immediately secure electronically recorded evidence at the scene like surveillance cameras and computers. All this evidence should be securely transported and stored following collection. Now that our scene has been investigated and the evidence safely transported and secured, what happens next? The physical evidence would be processed by a lab. If the local police do not have the technology to process that evidence, it would be sent to a state or federal lab to complete the processing for them. Okay, so now you're asking, why wasn't Alec arrested that night? The Fourth Amendment requires that any arrest be based on probable cause. Probable cause simply means that there is more than a suspicion that a suspect committed a crime, but not an absolute certainty. If the evidence collected at the crime scene doesn't initially provide enough information to issue an arrest warrant, prosecutors will not request one until there is enough evidence. So in the case of Alec Murdaugh, we must assume that the initial processing of the scene did not provide enough evidence for prosecutors to request an arrest warrant. But that doesn't mean that one will not be issued. It just means that it was determined that at that time, there wasn't enough probable cause or an imminent danger to the community to justify his arrest. The next step in the investigative process would be for officers to continue working on the case outside of the crime scene, interviewing witnesses and obtaining search warrants for additional evidence such as computers, cell phones, and vehicles. Each of these additional search warrants require probable cause to be shown as well. If law enforcement is going to search your phone for evidence in a murder, they must either obtain your consent or prove to a judge that there is a reason to search it. Once these warrants are obtained, the additional evidence must be sent out for forensic analysis, which also takes time. Sometimes during the review of evidence, it becomes clear that another warrant is required. Let's use a cell phone location history as an example. If law enforcement is reviewing a suspect's cell phone location history, and they realize that just prior to going to the scene of the murders that they went to a residence for 10 minutes, law enforcement may decide to request a search warrant for that residence to determine if there is any evidence there. Needless to say, the investigative process is arduous and often contains twists and turns. For more information on the search of cellular devices in criminal investigations, Dylan Nolan and I did a video earlier this week to break that down. All the evidence has been processed. There is enough evidence to arrest someone, so what happens next? Prosecutors would take all of this evidence and present it to a grand jury. The grand jury reviews the evidence, and then they determine whether there is sufficient evidence to issue an indictment. And that, my friends, is what we've been anxiously awaiting for in the Murdoch case. In South Carolina, typically murder charges are done jurisdictionally. The state grand jury is reserved for more complex cases that cross county lines. It's also important to note that even if the indictments were issued by the Colleton County Grand Jury, the state attorney general may still be placed in charge of the prosecution. Given the potential for conflict of interest in Colleton County, this would not come as a surprise. So a disclaimer. Not knowing much about the evidence collected due to the very tight-lipped investigation completed by SLED, I really can't give an opinion on whether or not I think indictments are long overdue or if the timing makes sense. But I can say that based on what sources are telling us, the evidence in this case was complex. Also, from the looks of it, the primary suspect has been in jail for quite some time on other charges. So rushing things was not necessary from a safety standpoint. Once the indictments are issued, the real work comes into play. Prosecutors need to take the evidence that they have and build an airtight case, one that will convince a jury that the defendant is guilty. I mean, beyond a reasonable doubt, guilty. And the defense team, they're also going to work. They're trying to provide the best defense for their client. And while we villainize them, we must remember that they also have a job to do, a duty to their client. The legal process in this case will not be swift, nor should it. The first step in the court process is the arraignment. South Carolina court procedures define an arraignment as the process of calling a defendant to court, serving and reading the indictment to the defendant, and requesting the defendant to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. In South Carolina, a defendant may waive their arraignment except in death penalty cases. The presiding judge will also determine whether the defendant will be held without bond or if there will be a bond set, and if so, what the conditions are for that bond. So now the real work begins for the prosecution and defense. We're talking about discovery. To begin preparing for trial, both sides engage in discovery. This is the formal process of exchanging information between the parties about the witnesses and evidence that they will present at trial. Discovery is basically the process of both parties showing their cards to each other. It's designed to prevent trial by ambush. During discovery, both the defense attorney and prosecution will interview the witnesses and the defendant, gather physical evidence like tangible objects, documents, and computer files, speak with the expert witnesses, and review the police report and witness statements. The discovery process is complicated, and when we get closer to that part of the investigation, I will do a video explaining the ins and outs of it. As long as the road was to get us to these indictments, expect an even longer road ahead. You can look at the indictments that Alec and his co-conspirators are already facing as an example. They've been announced. Arraignments have been held, but beyond that, it's been a slow road as the work behind the scenes is being done. This case likely isn't going to be resolved quickly. We should prepare for a lengthy trial. And as always, stay tuned to FITSNews and the Murdaugh Murders podcast for updates.